Pastor Anthony Hopkins was God and law all wrapped up in one. He ruled his family the way he wanted to, keeping them from socializing with others kept people from asking too many questions. As the children grew older, it was easier for them to be manipulated. They only knew the thinking and actions of their father, and whatever Anthony said God wanted from them is what they did. Church and home, home and church, studying the Bible, corporal punishment if Anthony felt any of the children were misbehaving. All they had was one another. They didn't need anything else. All they needed was Anthony, and God. All kind of things were going through Chantel's mind. She would see the deep freezer every time she entered the laundry room to wash clothes. Even though the pungent smell of her mother's decaying flesh was easier to bear, you could still smell it. Her mother was in there, having to have sex with her father to be able to one day go to heaven. Would God punish her if she told? Would she be cursed by God if she would tell again? Quote, "The Lord had covered it. Why would you want to uncover something the Lord had covered?" End quote. This is what Anthony would tell her. She'd done everything for her father, any time that he had asked. Now it was time for her to do something for herself. She could no longer be in this situation. Chantel was now 19 years old. She had ran away to her neighbor's house down the street, begging them not to tell her father she was there. She told the neighbor that her father was mad that a boy had called the house. Slowly, Chantel would divulge more information. She said her father had been sexually abusing her since she was 11 years old. Chantel had even told the pastor of her church. He didn't believe her. He told her that he had known Anthony for over 15 years, and he wouldn't do anything like that. Pastor Hopkins was a Christian man, he said. He told Chantel the devil had gotten inside her to say such horrible things about her father. The neighbor listened to these stories in horror. She told Chantel that she needed to speak with the police. Chantel explained to the police how her father had sexually abused her for years. The police chuckled. They actually laughed it off. This was all made up. Chantel wanted to talk to a boy, and her father wouldn't allow it. He was a pastor and maybe a little strict. Just listen to your father. He's Christian. Your father knows what's best for you. Thinking this was just a girl who wanted to get back at her father. Then she told the police something even more shocking. She hadn't even told the neighbor. She was pregnant by her father, and she believed her father had been sexually abusing her younger sister. She could tell by the things that he would say to her sister, and it was the same way he had treated her, the way he was now treating her sister. The police thought that Chantel was just saying this only to make the claims that her father had been abusing her more valid. She started to cry. No one, only the neighbor, had believed her story. She explained her pastor hadn't believed her. Her own mother hadn't believed her until she caught them several times. The police stopped her. The police asked, "Where's your mother, Chantel?" She told them her mother had been dead in the freezer for 4 years. If the police were laughing, they stopped. Is this girl really telling the truth? The police had looked on record that Arletha Hopkins hadn't been in existence since 2004. They checked the missing person reports. Maybe it's because she wasn't missing. She was dead. It's almost like the police had never heard of a man that would abuse his daughter, let alone his stepdaughter. Police would accompany Chantel back to the family home. Tasha was home with her siblings and would open the door. Tasha told the police that her father was out of town in Jackson, Alabama, preaching at a church. The police asked Tasha where her mother was. She responded instantly, quote, "Mom was in the deep freezer," end quote. The nonchalant, humorous police now had stiffened up. Had Chantel been telling the truth the whole time? One police officer even said this was like a horror movie. Tasha pointed at the shed out back. By now, the deep freezer had been removed from the home and in a shed powered by a generator. The police would walk towards the shed in the backyard. You could still smell the stench of death in the air. A second officer had got close to the freezer. There was roach poison and other items on top of the freezer that were removed. There was duct tape all over the freezer. They had to use scissors to cut the duct tape off. The officer said, quote, "Should we open it?" unquote. The second officer responded, "Yes." As the freezer door was slowly opening, flies began to swarm around the officers. Inside, 2 fingers of a hand he could vividly see, and a huge block of ice was in the freezer. It was definitely a deceased person. But was it Anthony Hopkins? The Department of Forensic Scientists had came to move the refrigerator. Whoever this was, the ice needed to thaw. Chantel explained her father had a tracking device on his car by the dealership in case of non-payment. Chantel was told that a paternity test would be given to find out if Anthony Hopkins is the father of our unborn child. Meanwhile, the children were placed in CPS, Child Protective Services. Police would arrive on July 28, 2008, to the Tabernacle Church in Jackson, Alabama. They stood in the back listening to the pastor Hopkins preach about forgiveness. The parishioners listened to the sermon, but the police standing in the back of the church, it was like an elephant in the room. You couldn't ignore it. As the police headed to the pulpit, it was like a scene out of a dramatic Hollywood movie. Anthony asked, could he finish up the sermon? The police allowed. The pastor then turned to his children and said, quote, "Please forgive me, my past, my present, and my future," end quote. The police asked him, was he Anthony Hopkins? After he responded yes, they told him he was under arrest. He asked for what? They responded, quote, "It is something to do with the dead body that you have in your freezer," end quote. As the handcuffs were placed on him, the congregation shouted out, "He's innocent. He did it. Murderer. Murderer. Burn." Or maybe that was just me. I could be a little dramatic. Police would speak with Tasha, who was now 17 years old. She denied a lot of the things that her sister said. She was still under the influence of her stepfather. A search warrant was obtained to 258 Ryland. In Anthony's room, the police removed scrapbooks and Valentine's Day cards signed by Anthony. He had quite a collection of porn and a book titled Evicting Demonic Intruders. In Tasha's home, a diary that belonged to her was found. An entry read, quote, "I want to get closer to God, but I don't want to keep having sex with my father to do it," end quote. Certain people would have to get over the fact that a Christian man or a man saying he was a Christian had been responsible for such horrors within his own family. April 2010, the trial would start. The case had went nationwide, meaning most everyone had heard about it. Jury selection was going to be difficult, and how long was his trial going to take? Arletha's stepmother, with some of the parishioners, were there. Pastor Porter, the one who was banned from the church, he spoke about Arletha. He described her as quiet. She didn't speak that much. He remembers Pastor Hopkins telling him he wished his wife was supportive, like his. Porter said he knew that there was trouble in the home after he had made a statement like that. But when he visited, he says there was no stress. The Hopkins was the ideal family, and Pastor Hopkins was, quote, a bullseye prophet, end quote. He even remembered the day he witnessed Hopkins and Chantel digging a hole. He said he didn't know that it was a grave. He even asked another pastor about Hopkins doing survey work. He was never doing survey work. No one pushed the issue, only rumors and gossip. A second pastor, Nelson, says in 2008, Chantel approached him and told him that she was pregnant by her father and her mother had been murdered. I'm not sure if this was the pastor that didn't believe her or if this was a pastor that helped get her to the police. I could only read public information, but I needed to just add this in. During the trial, Anthony did take the stand in his defense. He begged, he pleaded. He said God advised him a lot of the things that he did. He admitted in letters to friends and even on the stand that he was weak. He knew it wasn't right, and he struggled with it. He had started a purification process to cleanse himself. He hadn't touched his stepdaughter until she was 16, which is the legal age. Chantel seduced him. She entered the room wearing a chocolate negligee. He said he couldn't resist. He said, quote, I yielded to the temptation, end quote. He hadn't had sex in 4 years since his wife died. He spoke about how he loved his wife, but she was unhealthy, overweight, ate all the wrong things that weren't good for her. He did not kill her. She meant everything to him. God told him to keep his wife's body close to him. That way she remained all these years in the deep freezer to be preserved. Quote, I didn't want my wife stinking, end quote. He said he found her dead in the house with the children and the newborn alongside her. He was afraid to call 911. He also denied jumping up and down on his wife's body. He said she fit, quote, snugly inside, end quote. He also says he wished he would have had a funeral for his wife. It is also said in the court that while Anthony was in jail, he asked his parents to send him porn, the same parents that he told years ago that his wife had died during childbirth. He also had written various women letters and wanted them to respond in a detailed, lustful manner with sex involving him. I wonder how many of them were his ex-parishioners. That's something else that wasn't clear on how he responded to that. The eldest of Anthony's biological children, a daughter, would witness their father holding a hammer to their mother. She would testify on the stand against him. Tasha, she took the stand as well. Certain dates and times didn't add up. Anthony's lawyers tried to liken her to not being credible, but the same lawyer also stated that Hopkins didn't know what sexuality he was during this news conference. As for Tasha, the girl was young, scared, and most certainly traumatized. Chantel herself took the stand. She spoke about how she'd seen her mother on all fours, begging for her life. She said she was too scared, confused, and she didn't know what was going on. She grabbed her infant brother and she locked herself in the bathroom while her mother was in the other room dying. She wanted to call 911, but she was afraid she would get in trouble by her father. She spoke about many years of abuse, the pastor not believing her own mother not believing her, catching them, and the abuse was consistent. She suffered a miscarriage. Her father had taken to get her an abortion. Anthony Hopkins' biological children were not abused sexually, only his stepdaughters. However, all the children were mentally and emotionally abused. Arletha was wrapped in dirty bed sheets. The jaws of life had to be used in order to remove her from the freezer. Her body had to unthaw. Her parents had to give their DNA along with the DNA extracted from her tooth, which determined that it was her. There was no broken bones or trauma found, but based on the fact that her body had been left in a freezer for 4 years, it was hard to do an autopsy. It was hard to determine what actually happened, but it is believed that she was beaten and then strangled to death. The paternity test was taken, and the child that was already born and was 3 years old by now was, in fact, Anthony's. When the sentencing began, the children cried and held on to one another. Sitting in the front row, right there, their father could see. Anthony remained stone-faced, emotionless throughout the entire trial. The jury deliberated a little over 90 minutes. On April 7th, 2008, 39-year-old Anthony Jujuwan Hopkins was sentenced to life plus 51 years in prison. He walked out the courtroom handcuffed and said not a word. Since then, he has exhausted all his appeals. Some sources say the children ranging in ages from 3 to 17 were placed with Mary Best, Arletha's stepmother, and other relatives. While researching everything I could find in this tragic story, I did learn that Arletha's parents and Anthony's parents are alive. It seemed that Chantel reached out to several people during this time and told them what her stepfather had been doing. But if only the one person she told, her mother, would have believed her when she was 11 years old. Maybe things may have changed. Maybe things would be different. Maybe her mother would be alive. It seems that at that time she chose a man over her own child. I hate to say it. How often do we hear this? Back in 2008, a district attorney on this case said that it is a slim chance that these children will recover. It's been almost 15 years. The youngest child, which is Chantel's child, would be 18 years old now, and the rest all adults. I hope they have been able to adjust positively from the tragic events in their life.